I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm very proud to be the founder of Transparency Task Force. We are an international collaborative community of people who want the financial sector to behave better. We believe the financial industry is profoundly important to society, to economic stability, and yes, even political stability. That last point is very, very important. Many people are of the view that we've had a lot of volatility in our political landscape since the global financial crisis. And the message I'm trying to get across here is that the financial industry is incredibly important to us on so many levels. Whilst it's important, the evidence does suggest that it has a high predisposition to misbehave. And I would argue, you may agree, you may not, it's my view, I would argue that we let the financial industry misbehave more than we should. And that's happening because we're not regulating it closely enough, we're not controlling it closely enough. This does not mean that myself and Transparency Task Force are fans of bureaucracy and red tape and things that get in the way of business growing and flourishing. On the contrary, we are very supportive of the growth agenda the current government is pursuing very energetically. But we do believe there is a concept that we describe as smart regulation. Smart regulation optimizes the balance between checks and balances and rules and controls and governance and all that good stuff, whilst not creating needless box ticking and form filling and bureaucracy and that kind of thing. Those of you who know us well will know that we have members in 20 countries around the world who have this shared interest in the concept of sunlight is the best disinfectant, a phrase first used by Justice Brandeis, the American legal scholar and justice of the peace, etc., etc., etc. Sunlight is the best disinfectant was the philosophy that he espoused in a book he wrote back in 1914. And what we hope and believe is that transparency drives real change. We believe that because people are less likely to be naughty when what they're doing is out in the open where people can see it happening. We therefore are dedicated to, for want of a better phrase, shining the light into the shadows. Over the last few years, we've become increasingly interested in the work of various authorities, particularly, but definitely not exclusively, the Financial Conduct Authority, an organisation that we believe is acting in a very suboptimal way. Some of you will know that Transparency Task Force is the secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Investment, Fraud and Fairer Financial Services that published in November a very critical report about the FCA based upon much evidence and much testimony given to the APPG by 174 people. One of the themes in that report is that people are really finding it difficult to get justice. Much more than you would think, much more than should be the case. And this takes us to a question. The question is essentially, what's happening in the world of investigations and policing? Is it as good as it could be? Is there scope for improvement? Let's have a grown-up conversation about it. And we had such a conversation about it at the Fraud Summit the APPG ran on the 31st of October last year in Parliament. Our speakers tonight, the two professors and the doctor, there's got to be a Doctor Who joke somewhere. The two professors and the doctor were key speakers at that event, and they talked about their work. Myself and many others came away from hearing what the two professors and the doctors spoke about, feeling very impressed on several levels. The bit that you can almost take for granted, I did anyway, is that they really know their stuff. That's great, but that's actually not the bit that really impressed me. Because lots of people know the stuff that they're doing in their job. Why wouldn't you know your stuff? They really do know their stuff. The bit that I think makes the two professors and the doctor important to our community's work is a few remarkably significant characteristics. And Nick, John, and James, you might remember our very first conversation. You guys blew me away by your willingness to say it as you saw it, a willingness to constructively and in a balanced way, in an evidence-based way, criticize the system where you genuinely believe it is not working great. And that willingness to speak candidly is not really what we got used to from all kinds of people running all kinds of institutions and bodies and authorities. That was great. The other thing that really, really impressed me was, for want of a better phrase, this may not be quite the right word, but almost a passion for truth and justice. The guys came across to me as being sincere, authentic, motivated, and inevitably I became a fan straight away. Hence they spoke at the summit, hence the kind enough to be here this evening. I hope that gives you a feel, folks, for why the work of Dr. Nick Howe, Professor James Treadwell, and Dr. John Lambs, it's two doctors and one professor, is so relevant to us, particularly for those in our community who have been getting, for want of a better phrase, brain damage, trying to get the authorities to listen to them about the concerns that they've got, where individuals, rightly or wrongly, who am I to judge, rightly or wrongly, genuinely believe that the system is letting them down in one way or another. So, having heard the two doctors and the professor speak at the Fraud Summit back in October last year in Parliament, we immediately thought, can we please persuade them to try to come and share their insights with a wider community online, and that's what this evening's all about. I know these gentlemen well enough to know that I can practically just pass things over to them, because Nick does a particularly good job of kind of orchestrating and managing. So, folks, I'll get involved as and when appropriate. We'll leave the two doctors and the professor to kind of introduce themselves in whatever way that Nick decides to manage that, talk to you about their work, and when they feel they've covered what they want to cover, let's have a sensible grown-up conversation about your insights and experiences that are relevant to the conversation. But a couple of important points. Number one, they haven't brought a magic wand with them, so please nobody expect that that Nick or James or John are going to be able to dive into individual cases, wave a magic wand around and suddenly make things happen. It's completely and utterly unrealistic, right? So please manage your expectations in regard to that. Secondly, they're very good at using the power and the influence that they've got, but they've only got so much power and influence. Again, key point, same point perhaps, is don't expect these guys to work miracles. That's not why they're here. Why they are here is to introduce them to you, and for you folk to get an understanding of who they are, what they do, why they do it. You know, what's motivating them to do the work they do, because they could be doing lots of other things, I assure you of that, and hopefully make some friends. I hope that sets the scene, folks. Nick, I'm going to pass to you to pick it up from there. I give you complete license to manage this however you wish, and I'll just chip in as and when appropriate.
Thanks, Andy. So thanks, Andy, and thanks to Transparency Task Force for the kind invitation and the opportunity to get to meet new people and discuss important topics. What we were thinking of doing tonight, I'm just going to do a quick 5-6 minute overview of the Institute of Policing, and we all work at the University of Staffordshire. So I always describe us not as a posh university, but we're very much vocationally focused in what we do, but with our feet on the ground and real work and lived experiences. So I was going to start off setting the scene. I'll hand over to James, who is one of our leading and national criminologists here in the UK, who will talk about crimes of the powerful from an academic and again a lived experience. And then John works as a senior lecturer in the Institute of Policing, and I'll let John talk about the journey he's on and his research, inquiry and interest around some of the serious organised fraud, crime, etc., that no doubt we'll touch upon this evening. I'm going to try and share the screen, if I may, just for a second or two. Yeah, so we're all from the University of Staffordshire, and the university is based in Stoke-on-Trent, although we've got a campus down in London as well. Just by way of background, my background may or may not surprise people, being what's known as the director of the Institute of Policing, is that I was a police officer for many, many years in Staffordshire Police, and then towards the end of my service worked as a staff officer for what was then known as a Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary inspecting police services throughout England and Wales against set standards and what you would expect in terms of a significant public service. So basically, I ended up in, when I left the police, I worked at Birmingham City University, where we introduced a Bachelor of Science degree in criminal investigation, which may be of interest to some people online. I then left and went to the Derby University and focused on police leadership, and we did a lot of work internationally. And then I was given the opportunity back in 2019, against a change to police education, to come and lead the Institute of Policing and develop the Institute of Policing at the university. So I don't know if any of your colleagues online here or any of the participants online have tried to contact the university and discuss policing, but policing is very much a multidisciplinary subject and covers criminology, sociology, law and the like. So who do you actually pick up the phone and speak to? So what we wanted to do was corral all the experience across all the disciplines and sub-disciplines at the university into a single recognised identity. That doesn't mean I line manage the likes of James in criminology, etc. But it does mean that we frame our wider policing offer and link people together, recognising the breadth, as I say, that policing is, and particularly investigation. So we won a contract back in 2019 against a reform agenda that was about, and it touches to your point at the beginning, Andy, about the professionalisation of policing and investigation. So hitherto that point, it will be been fairly dislocated in terms of being in a central structure with a consistency. So you would get different standards of training and education in each force. And what the government sought to do via the Home Office at that time, back in 2019, was to start to provide a consistency and a public expectation wherever you went, wherever you were a victim of crime or investigatable crime, will get a consistent standard of service. And again, we're very much in support of that. So we deliver police education. Most police officers now either join an apprenticeship and get a degree after 3 years, they join with a degree, or they study at the university and get a degree, then join the police, or more latterly, I think the Home Office was slightly concerned about the diversity in policing, although I take a slightly different view, and widening participation. They've removed the requirement that you must have a degree or obtain a degree when you join the police. But fundamentally, we teach all those programs, and I'll talk about some of the postgraduate work that we do as well. So we do link in with across the university. We do a lot of work with gaming. We do a lot of work with engineering around crime prevention, physical harm measures, computing and cyber in particular, social sciences such as sociology, criminology, law and the like. And then fundamentally, something that makes us a higher education institution, we have an active interest in research. And so we act as a research incubation unit around that broader policing agenda. And then what we try and do, that we believe very much in theory to practice, is about joining up engagement for research teaching, if you like, and set our own excellent standards on the way that we actually do that. Can I move to the next slide, Andy? And again, where I take a slightly different view around a non-degree, not accredited route into policing that's recently come in from the beginning of this year. We've educated now over 4,500 officers, and actually we've made a fundamental difference to equality, diversity and inclusion, particularly in terms of the applicant makeup. So if you went back to pre-2019, probably around about 25% of applicants and officers were female. And you'll see some of the figures against the full forces that we're delivering education. That's not to be complacent and saying that we still haven't got a long way to go, but it's a fundamental positive step change, if you like, on the breadth of people coming into the policing, and equally in terms of ethnic minority representation that's broadly in line with the local demographic. Can I go to the next slide, Andy? So we provide a number of other developments as well. So those who don't necessarily have the qualifications to get into policing, we provide startup courses. We accredit tutor constable courses, the mentors of young officers and investigators. We do deliver a suite of masters, and the ones that probably particularly affect this discussion this evening is probably around leadership and particularly investigation. And then we run a whole short course portfolio, and we've put an apprenticeship around serious and complex crime investigation. So I'm blessed by 31 academics, which is quite a large investment for a university like Staffordshire, to invest in policing. And then we have a whole range of ancillary professional support colleagues working with us. Many of these are ex-police officers themselves, but not solely. So we have lawyers and criminologists working amongst our ranks as well. We do work internationally as well as nationally here in the UK. We do research, and we're commissioned by police and crime commissioners to provide an independent and objective voice, if you like. Next slide, please. And secondly, then we celebrate success. So we're very proud. We are for the educational partners for the National Police Chief Constables Council back in 2022. We've won the National Award in 2024 for the Protected Services Apprenticeship of the Year Award. And then we're particularly keen about the pastoral care. It's quite an emotional job, a lot of resilience required in policing. And again, we won national awards for the support we provide to our policing services. Now, when I come at this, I come at it from a perspective of objectivity, I hope. I've been out of policing 15, 16 years now. And what we try and provide is an ethical firewall between supporting the police, but our ability to research the police and act as critical friends. I make no apology, and I put my cards on the table. I am a friend of the policing, of the police service and police law enforcement agencies. But again, if you take, and I know it will affect many people online, if you like, as fraud, we think somewhere between 45% of all crime is fraud, and less than 2% of policing services is dedicated to fraud. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that that sum doesn't quite match and add up. So what we try and do is to skill and look at the skills that officers might require in the future and allow the services to be as efficient as they can. But they are public services. They're under austerity. I know that's denied publicly, but most of the forces that we're dealing with are managing multi-million deficits in their budgets over the next couple of years. And that's going to be a challenge. On top of that, of course, there's all the excitement regarding artificial intelligence and the way that can support professional services like the police and the like. But dare I say, the criminal community have been working on that for the last 20 years and are well ahead of the game. So there are some challenges ahead. So I'll probably pause at that point. It was merely to say we are the Institute, and I'll hand over to James, who is a big supporter and leads on our criminology front from the university. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you very much, and thank you. Yeah, there should be some science coming, which really we're just a talking point. Because against what Nick was saying, my line is very much supporting active criminal justice, trying to make change actually in the system where things go wrong, trying to improve the experience for victims, trying to build a better society, which I think is the role really of a criminologist. Now, my journey has overlapped very often. Like Nick, I'm a former practitioner. I've spent a lot of time at the coalface. I know how bad things can be when it comes to criminal justice, and that it doesn't necessarily always get things right. And I think the responsibility of good academics is to be a critical friend. Not necessarily to simply swoop in and sort of say, everything is terrible, but there's nothing that can be done better, but rather to kind of ask questions that hope to inspire better practices in many ways. Now, my kind of journey to financial crime comes in a slightly different way, insofar as I've always been interested as an academic in very high end sort of serious crime, particularly what we might consider serious organised crime and the serious organised crime community. And through that, and through a number of kind of research experiences looking at that and encountering some of the kind of most serious people that the state has convicted and incarcerated, I came to increasingly kind of recognize that the solution was not necessarily in criminal justice responses, but in entire system responses that resulted in agencies joining up and working together collaboratively, but also recognizing, you know, what the generators of crime were. And on one hand, serious organised crime is largely an economic and business-based activity. So you need an economic and business-based response in some ways, but you can't simply limit that to policing and criminal justice. You need to understand that as a kind of business activity, it's business responses that are needed. And as Nick was saying, you know, our criminal justice system is pretty bad at some things. It's probably most bad at it's probably most ineffective at tackling high-end serious organized crime, because a lot of investigation, a lot of policing activity, particularly today, tends to be fairly reactive, and it reacts to circumstances. It's not necessarily proactive. It's not necessarily always investigation led, or it's reactive investigation. I tend to think that if you can go upstream and stop something from happening in the first place, it takes away that requirement then to act and investigate. And we don't do nearly enough of that. And particularly where we don't do nearly enough of that, it started to dawn on me, is where serious organised crime is concerned, is in the financial sector. And through that, I eventually came to start to look at the financial sector a lot more. And I'm going to echo everything that Andy said. That, you know, in essence, you know, we can't escape the fact that the financial sector is of vital importance. That it's tremendously important for giving us many of the benefits that we enjoy in the United Kingdom today. And, you know, in no way, shape, or form do I want to return people to a sort of feudal existence of you know, living in small villages and gathering things together. We're in a global world, but when we consider how we really tackle serious and organised crime and where we're effective at it, if you look at the case of Al Capone, for example, and you know, the response to him was to catch him for tax evasion and non-payment of taxes. Another lesson that I try and teach people is criminal's criminal in all sorts of settings and contexts. And when you act as an organised criminal involved in, for example, drug importation or high-end financial crime, you're also quite likely to drive whilst disqualified. You're also probably going to be involved in all manner of other activities. And ultimately, if we begin to understand those things, we can essentially form up better responses. Now, that said, where particularly I wanted to start off with talking about the latest book, Crimes of the Powerful, that I wrote with two colleagues. It's something that we were writing about in that was to not just to consider the individual actions of offenders, though, but to think about the context in which they emerge, and to think about some of the things that kind of history teaches us. And we teach all sorts of things, and Nick will know this, and John will know this in and around policing. For example, I can reel off now, you know, that in 1829 we created the Metropolitan Police Force. That the Metropolitan Police Force arose out of a period of kind of social unrest. Not long prior to the creation of the Metropolitan Police Force, we had Peterloo, for example, you know, and it was very much that imperative that created the kind of orthodox accounts of the creation of you know, the state's response and even now the kind of framing of the state's response through policing to organised crime. I'd never read a criminology book that gave any kind of history of financial institutions or what they did. And none had kind of recognized that, for example, the Bank of England only dates back to, in essence, 1694. Got a little prop with me. It's a £10 note. If you read the top of the £10 note, it says, "I promise to pay the bearer on the demand the sum of £10." Why did the Bank of England come about in 1694? Well, essentially what it did is it nationalised debt. But not long after the Bank of England came about nationalising debt, it also was pretty important in creating, in some ways, the very first major financial crime that we've ever, which was the burst of the South Sea bubble in 1711. The South Sea Company, which was trading, was the talk of London. Rich investors were pouring money into it. The government very much backed it. In 1711, essentially an act of parliament to allow for the South Sea Company to trade and so on. And what ultimately happened? Well, a kind of a runaway fraud in many ways, where there was a continual kind of trading off debt, created an economic crash that burned lots and lots of people. And the same thing happens again and again and again. And this is where environment and context matters, really, really does matter, I feel, and one of the kind of lessons that we don't necessarily teach. Every time that we've been through a period of runaway easing of financial regulations, the result has been detrimental for people. What ultimately happens is that the worst elements rise to the top, and they exploit it ruthlessly for self-enrichment and self-benefit, and everybody else pays. And that has happened, and that's been a kind of sustained system that we've allowed. And the financial system does not have to work or operate in that way. But the combination of criminal justice and the financial system is terrible, because essentially what happens, and again, I think this is something that Nick was alluding to, the criminal justice system tends not to see that that exploitation as crime. It tends to see it as a kind of unethical but normal business practice that isn't ours and isn't ours to own or take ownership of. Somebody else's problem, and therefore they don't respond and they don't react, even though we've grown the only kind of capacity to react really through them. And that creates in some ways a total mess. Now, if we look more broadly at the kind of reaction to crime in England and Wales at the moment, we've got a situation where police forces across the UK are clearing up, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're successfully prosecuting. They're clearing up only around about 5.3% of all crime that's reported to them, which is it means the vast majority is not being cleared up. It's not resulting in conviction of offenders, and that is to be for the sort of low-level activity that police officers can routinely encounter, or where evidence is fairly easy to get. There is some variation here. Murder, for example, runs at a much higher clear-up rate, but then counter to public perceptions, it's very, very often very easy to solve murder. You arrest the nearest and dearest and most significant person to the individual, and for the most part, you have the murderer. When it comes to high-end financial crime, it's not just the state in the United Kingdom that's failing. It's every state. And it's every state at every level. And in part, it's born out of a number of myths that we write about in Crimes of the Powerful. One, for example, and one of the most pertinent repeated myths, is that in essence, the system will work so long as you can stop dirty money from entering into it. There's no such thing as dirty money. There's money and there's money. And the financial system, by and large, makes use of money wherever it can. And that particularly is the reason that, after the global economic crisis in 2008 and 2009, the United Nations and the head of the Office for Drugs and Crime said that the thing that averts the wholesale system meltdown is essentially cartel and drug money keeping liquidity going. We think about the financial sector in the United Kingdom, and we should, and its value is massive. It's huge. It contributes a vast amount to the system in any given year. But if we also think about where illicit activity is and how much we recover from against those markers of illicit activity, which vary dependent on whether you listen to the government of the United Kingdom or the United States government, or whether you listen to campaign groups and interest groups, or whether you listen to the United Nations. But we only recover about 1% of the money tied to criminal activity. It's tiny. We have pretty much no ability to reseize the wealth and the assets of offenders once it's into the system, and it quickly gets into the system. And just about every serious criminal that I've ever encountered is also benefiting from that lack of financial oversight. And I'll kind of end today with a story which I tell in Crimes of the Powerful, and I don't fully name the individual, and I won't here either. But I went for lunch in a Surrey hotel with someone who'd recently been released from prison custody. He's probably identified as suspect number one in just about every serious organised crime that's been committed in the UK, sometimes completely artificially. He's linked with 25 murders, has been convicted of very, very serious events, including murder, and was largely known for his involvement as a kind of key figure in the criminal underworld. He's also a friend and associate with others that would occupy that position, who were named, for example, in things like the Tiberius Report, which you can get online. And if you want to have a look into and get some insight into how serious organised crime works and operates at and around London, although it's slightly dated now, the Tiberius Report is good and useful reading, and it identifies a number of the kind of key criminal players in and around London. What unites all of those individuals is their involvement in business and finance, and how they use the financial system essentially to make themselves over time legitimate. And in particular, the allegation about the guy that I was having lunch with was, he'd managed to sit in a prison cell for a number of years and come out, despite that, very, very rich and very, very wealthy. And I wanted to talk to him about that. And so I asked him, when you were released from prison, what was the first thing that you did? And he said, I went to the showroom and bought myself and both my sons top of the range vehicles. I blew about £1 million straight away. And this is someone that the state had been watching for years and years and years. And he then said, the thing about making money, James, is there's no such thing as an ethical pound note. Anyone who's ever been involved in business up to a couple of £1 million has kind of hurt people. But if you really want to understand, how serious crime works, you've got to understand it is all about the money. It absolutely is about, the financing of it is absolutely key. And if people really understood that, some of the people I'm friends with would be regarded as absolute captains of industry in this country, because we've put millions into the economy, and we've helped to stimulate all sorts of programs and businesses and so on. And I was kind of sat there and I was thinking, yeah, and I'm sure that that's the case, but very often built on the pains of other people to the very kind of narrow interest of only yourselves. and how much is out there that the state could take back, and how much better could we be at policing even the low level if we started to take that seriously? Um, and we have the powers. We absolutely have the powers to do that. We have unexplained wealth orders. We have everything that could ever be needed in some ways to take on all sorts of crime and criminality is there if they were to be drawn on and used effectively. And I think the thing that's missed very often in criminal justice is that the golden thread that runs through just about all crime, whether it be the street level drug deal through to the high end, most global connected forms of crime, the golden thread that runs through it is fraud. Whether we look at the 9/11 attacks by members of Al Qaeda, or we look at the street level drug dealer who's using Western Union to transfer money and doing that alongside very often lower level frauds, the golden thread is the financial conduct. And we're abysmal at recognizing that and investigating it. And we're abysmal at recognizing that that is the starting point for effective criminal justice. So that's a pretty bleak and pessimistic account of where we are at the moment. But if you want to kind of know more, if you want to know more of the history and have a bit more of a look, it's written up in Crimes of the Powerful. If people don't want to shell out the expensive price that publishers pay for it, perhaps shouldn't say this. Contact me directly, and I'll find a way to get you to read any chapter, including the chapter on financial crime that you'd like, and make it available to you. But I think the purpose for myself and Nick and John, one of the purposes is rethinking what we do in criminal justice and where we orientate our activities, so that we can actually, we can police more effectively and deal with social problems more effectively, and sometimes do better, having retasked a little bit. And I think for me, financial crime is the answer.
James, what you've said so far, what Nick said so far, has been absolutely fantastic. There's a few points I put in the chat which we'll come back to, but I think much of what you've just covered is of enormous interest to our community. We'll come back to those points in a short while, but thank you very, very, very much. We're going to go to our second doctor, Dr. John. Please do take the mic, as it were, John, and share with us what you'd like to think and talk about, and we'll have a bit of a general discussion, Q&A, and we'll see where the conversation takes us. Thank you very much, Nick and James, so far. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, evening all. I'm Dr. John Bahadur-Lamb, and as Nick graciously introduced me earlier, I'm one of the senior lecturers at the Institute of Policing. I always describe myself as a career academic. So I've been very fortunate, despite growing up on a council estate, to go undergraduate, master's, PhD, academic job, which does make me very privileged and very fortunate. But I think due to my background, I've always had an interest in crime, and particularly street level crime. But where I'm interested is how street level crime often plays out at a much higher level than you'd probably think. So in my research, I've looked at things like terrorism, serious organised crime, and how they link to the very local. And this led to a piece of research that I did with James and Nick in Staffordshire, looking at business crime. So what crimes across that county affect small and medium enterprises? And this has led to an ongoing area of research that I'm interested in, which looks at the role that our high streets play in fraud, corruption, and kind of the enabling of what are often very high level criminal activities, which often go really overlooked by the majority of people, and go completely overlooked by our criminal justice system and our investigatory organisations. So what does this actually mean? Well, what I'm interested in is how the changes in our high streets enable something that the criminologist Dick Hobb calls the glocal, which is a horrible sort of smashed together word, but it sums up really well. So this is where something that is very, very local, your local pub, your local nail bar, your local car wash, your local American candy shop, and we'll come back to those, are often actually the front for international or global crimes and global organizations that are making use of lax regulatory processes present in the financial sector in the UK to turn illicit money into licit money. So to turn illegal money into money that can be legitimately used in the wider economy. Now, this often doesn't seem possible. This often sounds kind of like something out of a thriller, a pulp fiction book. Because what we're effectively saying is that regardless of the size of town that you live in, and I live in a small town in the Midlands of about 40,000 people, we're saying that if you live somewhere like I do, there will be, and I will categorically say that, there will be people involved in very high level financial criminality operating on your high street. And you have probably interacted with them, and you've probably not realised you've interacted with them. And hopefully my rambling for the next 10 minutes or so is going to get you thinking about what's going on around you in a slightly different way. So the sort of things I'm talking about are, hopefully you've all noticed that your high streets have changed over the last 15, 20 years. And kind of some of this is down to wider austerity measures and down to a struggling economy and down to a change in how people shop. So we've had the rise of online retailers like Amazon, eBay and others. And that has led to a decline in kind of in-person, physical, real-world purchases. So, largely people have lost their baker, their greengrocer and their butchers from their high street, and it's been replaced with either an online retailer or a giant supermarket. What you would probably noticed spring up in their place, regardless of the size of town you live in, is a whole range of service-based shops, service-based, often cash-led institutions. The most famous examples of these are barbershops and nail salons. Now, I'm not going to name the town that I live in. If you Google me, it's not that hard to find, but I'm not going to name it for the purpose of the recording. Is a town of about 40,000 people just north of Birmingham. And within a mile of the centre of the town centre, and I've counted these in real life, there are 41 barbershops and 37 nail salons. Each of those barbershops has on average about 4 or 5 chairs, and the nail salons have got 6 or 7 nail desks. That is not sustainable by a population of 40,000 people, even if every single person living there is getting their hair cut every day and their nails done every other day. It's just not a sustainable business model. There is not enough money flowing in that area. So how do these shops, which often look very glitzy, they often employ lots of staff, how are they actually functioning? Well, it's my argument that they are the fronts for these global organizations that I'm talking about. So what they do is they effectively use cash transactions, which are basically unregulated in this country, to turn very large sums of money into legitimate sums of money that can then flow in to those organizations and finances that James was talking about earlier. So if you've got £250,000 of, for sake of argument, cocaine money that is sat in cash in shoeboxes that you can't really do anything with because an unexplained wealth order will hit you, you might want to buy yourself a barbershop. And yes, you will lose money in the shop fit. It will cost you £15,000 or £20,000 to shop fit it. You will lose money in paying salaries to the barbers, although there are ways round of paying those salaries and ensuring the money comes back to you. And you will end up paying tax, potentially, to HMRC. But what you will be able to do is turn about £200,000 of that money from unusable, effectively just cash, into deposited in a bank account, perfectly clean and legal money. How, and I'm not encouraging you to do this, you asked me, is simply because if you've got a nail salon with 8 desks and a set of nails costs approximately £40 and takes an hour, you open the shop for 10 hours a day. I can't do the maths that quickly, but 8 times 40 times 10 is a lot of money daily going through that business. And nobody is going to check or be able to check that you've actually done the sets of nails, because there is no product. Particularly if you just have an Instagram page with loads of pretty pictures of nicely done nails or pretty pictures of nicely done haircuts, it looks like you're functioning. And if you happen to get some walk-ins and people actually happen to use your business for its supposedly legitimate purpose, all the better, because now you're also making some extra profit. Why does this matter? Well, I believe that this matters for 3 reasons. Firstly, it's the subversion of our high streets. We've gone from having high streets that are legitimate economic drivers of small towns to things that serve criminal enterprises. This actually has a negative impact on our wider economy, because it makes it harder for legitimate small businesses to do things like rent shop space, because rents are really high, because these criminal enterprises will pay whatever they need to in order to rent the space that they want. It inflates kind of the belief in demand for these services, which encourages a kind of a false entrepreneurial spirit. So people might think, oh, there are lots of nail bars, I can definitely have a go at a nail bar, when actually it's probably an oversaturated market. Third, it speaks very heavily to the failure of our regulatory systems. Why does the UK and our high street get used for these things? Well, it's because, firstly, anybody can register a company at Companies House for about £100 with no checks or balances. I know they've tightened it up a little bit recently, but I had a brief search on there today and I found a huge list of companies that are registered under King Arthur as the director. I also found dozens of companies that are called United Kingdom Limited or United Kingdom PLC, all of which had fake directors' names, clearly fake directors' names, and are probably registered to some unknown individual's house or property somewhere. That enables a level of hiding who's running these businesses that's just not possible elsewhere. Secondly, the way that small businesses are policed in terms of their accounting is effectively non-existent. So as long as you are prepared to submit micro accounts, and you won't even be chased if you don't do that, and you stay under about £500,000, you are unlikely as a small business to ever become across the regulatory watcher's eyes. HMRC or that are unlikely to ever look at you. Which means that you can just casually sit there in a small town and continue doing these things indefinitely. But then lastly, this actually is a major security issue. These fronts are not just local individuals who are selling drugs locally. They're often the fronts for real international power brokers. So I know that in the UK, a lot of these are used by the Albanian organised crime groups, Kurdish, often linked to terrorist, Kurdish freedom fighter groups or terrorist groups, depending on which side of that divide you sit upon, British organised crime groups, Indian organised crime groups, Pakistani organised crime groups, and Pakistani state-level intelligence, and others. They're basically, the whole world is represented on our high streets, using them to turn their money, their illicit money, into licit money. That means that we are effectively importing serious criminal players into the UK because we won't take control of the low-level end of our financial regulation. Is it then any surprise that when we move up the scale, this just gets worse? This just appears to get worse and worse and worse, because we know from investigations done into banks that places like HSBC knew that they had whole numbers of small businesses and medium businesses that were fake doing this, and they failed to do their checks and balances because, as James said earlier, they just like the money. So if you're going to be putting 100k, 200k, £1 million, £2 million through their bank as a business every year, they're not going to ask you the questions that they should, because they're not interested in asking the questions that they should, because that money appears to be legitimate. And that money can then be used elsewhere in the financial, in the economy. So my interest is, what can we do to spot these things? And why should we be asking these questions? And that's where my research is currently driving me. And it's some of the things that I'm interested in. And I think that's about all I've got to say this evening. So I'm quite happy to take questions now, Andy, if that's okay.
Thank you very much indeed. This is so interesting. This is so interesting. I put a few things in the chat, folks, that we might come back to later. But before we do anything else, I'm sure everybody's going to want to join in with me. Can we please thank our two doctors and a professor for their presentation so far? It's been really, really interesting, very, very educational, and frankly, so relevant to our work. Gentlemen, let me take you straight to what's front of mind for me. I think I'm going to cover 2 points, and we can then kind of share the conversation around after that. The first point I want to make is that a lot of the members of Transparency Task Force are people who've been done over, for want of a better phrase, by a financial institution. In some cases, it is a financial institution that was illegitimately created to do fraud and to rip people off. These are organisations such as those who set up pensions transfer scam shells, and people's money ended up in bogus investments overseas that never really existed, etc., etc. And it's perfectly obvious that the whole modus operandi was riddled with criminal intent. So that's in the box of criminal activity through fraud and defrauding. And to my mind, the big problem we have there is getting the regulators, the police, Action Fraud, City of London Police, and all the rest of them to work like a team and to be motivated to hunt down the baddies. Frankly, I'm using pretty emotive language, I know that. It kind of breaks my heart to know that there are people in our community who had their entire life savings stolen from them 10, 12, 15 years ago. And the people who actually did it are still doing it. Go figure that. Go figure that. I promise you, I'm not making this up. They've managed to dance around the regulatory perimeter and use all kinds of very, very cunning, crafty, fox-like strategies to protect themselves, and phoenixing and all this stuff. There's one of our members, I'm not going to mention the person's name, one of our members continues to be heartbroken by the fact that the person who stole her and her husband's life savings is a very wealthy individual acting with seemingly impunity. That's absolutely tragic. There's got to be a whole bucket load of stuff going wrong there, but it does happen. It does happen. That's all in one box. These are criminals operating very, very nastily, causing havoc. In some ways, the second group are actually harder to describe, because when you start describing them, it sounds like you must be making it up. These are, talking about the high street banks that, and it's proven, that deliberately and deliberatively sought to steal money from the business owner customers by way of things like interest rate hedging products. Not only did they do it to thousands of people, for example, there's a case going through the courts at the moment, long story short, 5,000 victims of this stuff have not been looked after properly by the regulator. The FCA decided to not make the banks compensate. It sounds nuts. The statement is absolutely true. The Financial Conduct Regulator made a decision to ignore the recommendation of a report by a KC, John Swift KC. His report cost 7 million quid. And the conclusion of the report was, FCA, the banks have behaved badly, make them compensate the folks that haven't yet been compensated. I promise you that's the gist of it. The FCA turned around to that and said, no, we're not going to, and you can't make us. And as a consequence, one of the all-party parliamentary groups, not the one that we run, but another one, ended up having to raise 100 grand. We were involved in the fundraising to take the FCA to court. And they were literally in court in December last year, basically accused of acting irrationally, as well as, in my opinion, completely morally bankrupt, deliberately ignoring the recommendation of the KC. So you've got a regulator failing to do what every government's primary responsibility is, which is to protect its citizens. The regulator knew that the banks had acted wrongly and were somehow happy to throw these 5,000 plus people under a bus. So we're not talking here about outright criminals. We're talking here about major financial institutions, including household name banks that advertise on the TV, exploiting vulnerable people in the most egregious and cunning and horrible way. And it is crime. We know it's crime. We know it's crime because, for example, Anthony Stansfeld, the former police crime commissioner at Thames Valley, made his force look into some of that stuff, and we ended up with some bankers going to jail. So 2 points here. One is the failure of the system to act responsibly and responsively enough to the victims of outright financial crime by professional criminals, inverted commas. And the other is the failure, I don't know which is worse, the failure of the regulatory environment to provide an appropriate degree of protection to people being shafted by, for example, banks or some other financial institutions. I've gone on a little bit there because, frankly, it really, really upsets me thinking about all this stuff, because I, on a daily basis, speak to people whose lives have been ruined by this very, very thing. Our two doctors and our professor, would any of you like to respond to what I've just said? And please feel free to criticise, challenge, refute what I've just said, or are you broadly willing to believe what I've just explained?
No, I'm more than willing to believe, Andy, and I think, you know, the problem has long been, and it wouldn't be allowed in any other organisation. You know, if there is a problem with police corruption, you know, the police are not going to be able to sit there and say, well, the solution lies within our hands, so you lot go off and we'll have a few meetings and put something together and come back and we'll tell you that we've put our house in order, and then you can trust us entirely without any independent oversight to put our house in order. And yet, when it comes to the financial system, that's always been the response when there has been crisis. When there has been crisis, rather than governments and state level stepping in to kind of say, look, this is, and in part, I think it's to do with some of the complexity and the failures to kind of understand, and the notion that this is, you know, it's an arena that needs such specialist knowledge that, you know, we can't possibly find any other way of dealing. You know, if you look at the Wolfsburg Group, you know, the Wolfsburg principles, which are there to prevent they're essentially the essence of what anti-money laundering should be. You know, they're signed up to and agreed by the big banks. You know, we're talking about you know, the biggest of players. The exact same banks that have subsequently all been convicted, as in the case of, you know, money laundering by HSBC, you know, they've all essentially broken the very principles that they drafted, signed up to, and said that they would be keeping. And there's some really fascinating stuff that goes on that potentially, I think, or is going on, that potentially could at least open again that kind of the ability to kind of have a debate about who should be doing things. I think it's really interesting. For example, if you look at the case of Tom Hayes with LIBOR rigging, you know, what in essence is going to come out of that, and I'll put my prediction down, and it will take a long time to happen, will be a scandal a bit like the post office, where eventually everybody realizes that those who were thrown under the bus knew, but everybody else knew as well, and that they left them to take the fall. I would imagine it's got parallels with what happens in some ways in the post office scandal that I saw someone put in the chat. You know, it takes a long time for people to catch up, but ultimately, you know, if people knew what was going on, they'd be outraged. And going back to what's on that note, you know, the promissory, trust is a vital ingredient. If all trust erodes, your financial institutions, you know, have no real power. They have no real value. And they're the very ones that are eroding the trust at the moment. You know, essentially, it needs the state to step in. You know, it needs the state to step in and say, actually, we're going to hold these groups to account, and we cannot allow them to mark their own homework because they don't do it. And it's the first order of the state. You know, if not protection of its own citizens, what's the purpose? What do you have? And the state will protect its citizens in some ways when it comes to crime, but as John was saying, from the lowest level, you know, on your high streets, right the way up to high-end financial crime, when that happens, the state washes its hands.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you. I'm very greedily going to make a point that relates to a topic that Professor Adnati spoke about at a recent event. But folks, those of you that don't know Professor Adnati, she's a fabulous professor operating out of Stanford. The point I'm making is this. I think a lot of people think that the UK has got a particular problem with this financial crime stuff, this money laundering stuff, because frankly, the enablers, i.e. the accountants, the lawyers, the specialist trust vehicle creators and all that lot, who legally, but not necessarily morally, make an absolute fortune off the back of creating all kinds of shenanigans, I don't know what the right word is, to literally enable what's going on. And these are organizations with huge budgets, huge resources, massive influence in government. And we then end up with this kind of tension between how motivated is the government to clear this stuff up? And every time I think about Companies House, I end up with this kind of worrying thought. It's so bad. It's so bad. It must be deliberately bad. Otherwise, they would just have cleared it up years ago.
Andy, just a very final point, and it's one of the things that one of the things that I've been trying to stress about our teaching of history and why history is useful. And I went back to the sort of start of the Bank of England. You know, we all learn the reason for the Second World War, don't we? What's the start of the Second World War? Well, we're told the start of the Second World War is that Hitler invades Poland in some ways. You know, you might go back or so on. Now, actually, what about if we go back to 1931 and we start it with essentially the bankruptcy of Austria's biggest bank, which gives the rationale for Hitler to rise to power in many ways. And we think about that as a failing of the state to kind of regulate. And if you do that and you kind of rethink that, you know, you begin to rethink the history of how he was able to kind of write the anti-Semitism into his kind of agenda and essentially kind of capture the German nation and fuel them on a divisive rhetoric. And we're quite concerned at the moment in the United Kingdom about the ability of people to fuel people and other on a divisive rhetoric. You know, every time we've seen that sort of horrendous situation arise in many ways in the world where there are terrible crimes to be committed, it happens in the wake of financial crises that you know, essentially are foreseeable. They're preventable in some ways, but it requires state regulators to step in and do something about it. The costs of not doing that will be astronomical. You know, at some point in the future, that they absolutely will be. And that in many ways is what we should be concerned about. Yes, I realise, you know, 173.6 billion comes to the UK economy every year because of the financial services industries, and they do tremendous value and good and so on. Yeah, but you know, the Serious Fraud Office, the Financial Conduct Authority are the organisations that should be there to keep them in line, and others, you know, lots of others we could mention. Those groups cannot be allowed to mark their own homework, and yet we continually allow that, and it will create, at some point it will create catastrophe again. It absolutely will.
You're so right. I'm struggling to contain myself. I promise we will go to Nigel, then to Ian. For example, there's this Damien the Dobbs review that people have been waiting years and years and years and years for to do with Lloyd's and all the rest of it. Just as an example, it's like 5 years overdue.
Mm.
This is a review done by a bank about that bank's misconduct. Given complete control as to how to do it, when to do it, and what to publish. It drives you nuts. I'll try not to get too wound up. We are going to go to Nigel Cairns, who's much calmer and much more sensible than I am. So you'll probably understand what Nigel's about to say. It's far better than the gibberish I've come up with so far. Nigel.
Sometimes, Andy, sometimes. Thank you very much, James, John and Nick. Fantastic presentations. And yeah, to pick up on what James has just been saying, I think it's common currency probably amongst most of us here that the start point of the problem is the political appetite to tackle fraud as the baseline cause of everything. I don't think that's a big secret. The big problem is, and this is where I'd be interested to hear your opinion, is why is there so little political appetite to tackle fraud when the politicians are perfectly aware? They're not ignorant of this situation, I'm sure. Can we have your thoughts?
I'll jump in here, James, if you don't mind first.
Yeah.
I have a very cynical view of this, and my belief is that we've seen effectively regulatory and political capture since probably the mid-1970s onwards. I think we undermined through various cost-cutting exercises our security services and our financial regulators, and there is too much of a grey area between the black illegal market and the white legal markets for finances in this country, and therefore it's not looked at because politically they know that it would open serious, it would shake out serious skeletons basically across the political spectrum. I'm not saying that directly politicians are corrupted by this process, but I do think large sections of our professional bodies, accountants, bankers, lawyers, are corrupted by this. And that is politically too much of a risk for people to face up to wholesale. It'd also be kind of political suicide, because you'd have to admit that we've enabled a set of criminal activities that are probably more harmful than most crime that we think about to flourish in this country.
HSBC's been mentioned a number of times. It's also my bank, and I've had a dispute with them for 17 years now. So perhaps I'm a little bit sort of cynical as far as they're concerned. But I think something that sort of reinforces what you were just saying is the fact that a few years ago, the head of MI6, on leaving MI6, was recruited by HSBC Bank to serve on its board. So with that sort of knowledge and background, we've got to think that there's little hope without a revolution or something of that nature, which I think James was alluding to.
Yeah, although I think, there is part of me that thinks that change is possible, because, politics is democratic, and I think if people knew the truth, there would be absolute outrage, but very often they don't know the truth. This is not, complex financial crime is not that which gets headlines. It's not that which kind of causes the blood to boil in the populace at the moment, although again, when people are exposed to what they see as kind of hypocrisy and the of the wealthy and the elite and politicians are classed in that way, Nigel. Yeah, absolutely. You do enter into those kind of realms.
Well, I'm sure you'd agree that a lot of the media, thankfully not all, there are fantastic exceptions, but a lot of the media is captured in exactly the same way.
Yeah, and it's the same. Well, it's the same structures of ownership as well. You know, I mean, one of the things we're saying that and you know, I'm quite critical of some aspects of academia, which you might think are kind of, you know, academics dancing around on the head of a pin. But I cannot stand the French sociologist Michel Foucault, in part for porting into, you know, the academic disciplines these notions, for example, that power is everywhere, you know, and diffuse and everywhere. You know, we should look at every kind of representation of power in some ways, because actually, you know, yeah, that's not really helping us in a world where we've got only around about 2,640 billionaires. But those people, you know, and the power that they have and the institutional capture that they have, you know, is absolutely massive. And if you think about media, for example, as you were saying, Nigel, it's the same people that very often own the multinational corporations that then own the media, that own the, you know, it's concentrated in a tiny number of people's hands, and that dictates how things will be kind of represented. It's not that power is everywhere, actually. It's power is in a very small number of people's hands, and you need to understand that and recognize that they're not necessarily serving your interests, you know, in what they tell you, and you might not want to believe them. Yeah, so I mean, it is complex, but you know, we definitely need to get far more kind of comfortable in making those who have become super rich and super wealthy uncomfortable about the state's willingness to kind of pry into some of their financial affairs. We need to have institutions that show far less kind of deference towards financial experts as well, and question what they say. Probably the best thing that we could do as a country is to kind of enhance the economic understandings and add a real kind of understanding of economics to the national curriculum, and raise people to actually understand that, you know, the whole system very often starts off by lying to you, you know, and we see that occasionally, and at times, you know, there is no magic money tree. Oh, but we've just found the magic money tree because we need it at the moment. Oh, but there's no magic money tree again now, you know. If people don't necessarily cotton on to the frauds, but I think, you know, that it isn't just the people who've been victims of the bad actors out there. That, you know, I think if the public knew more, there would be more pressure, and I think pressure can begin to bring about change.
Thanks, guys. We're going to go to Ian Duffield now, and after Ian, as we have Professor Admati with us tonight, who some of you already know from a recent meeting, is a professor at Stanford with a great interest on the risks and adverse consequences of deregulation. But after Ian, we invite Professor Admati to chip into the conversation if she would like to. Mr. Ian Duffield, lovely to have you with us, sir, as always. Folks, as are many of you, Ian is a big-time volunteer for the cause of TTF and has been doing outstanding work helping to challenge the FCA's treatment of the victims of the Woodford scandal, of which Ian and sadly his wife are one. Ian, over to you, sir. Please unmute. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Andy. This will lead to a question for an opinion from our three, and may I say, excellent speakers. Absolutely, this has been an absolutely excellent presentation. My experience over some years in working for a large company, a very large company, and seeing some of the things that were going on at a sales level, and I gradually formed the opinion that offenders go where the money is. They go where the rich pickings are. And what I saw was a retail level, because the company I'm talking about served at a retail level, but also served businesses direct. And it's no surprise that a sales transaction to a business will be in the thousands, as opposed to a retail transaction where it's in the tens of pounds. And the behaviour that I saw was that the business sellers, or sellers to other businesses, because they were based on a commission basis, was where all the offending was going on. And of course, the answer to this is that's why you have managers, isn't it? And that's why you have directors. Except they were also incentivized on the turnover of their unit or indeed the company. And it was only after a significant number of years when we had a change of directors. And I've been harping on about this for quite some time because I'm not a person who keeps my mouth shut, as Andy will assert. That I was allowed and asked to get involved in starting to investigate some of this and taking on gradually a legal and then a compliance role. Fortunately, and that just reaffirmed my opinion that if you want to know where the offenders are, just look where the money is.
Follow the money.
And one of the issues and one of the beliefs I have is that the reason we are seeing this level of offending going on in the financial services sector is because that's where the money is. These people, salesmen, is what they are. Fund managers are salesmen, right? They are dealing in transactions worth millions. And that is where they will gravitate towards to get their snouts in the trough. Now then, as I've got involved with the Transparency Task Force and got involved with the government and political side of things, or got more knowledge, is what I've gained since my wife and I had a lot of money taken from us. And I see that if you want to look where the money is in government departments, you look at the Treasury, because they hold the purse strings. That's where the money is. And I also became aware, because at one point I worked for the civil service, that if you look at the civil service entrance exams, which civil servants are obliged to take, the results of those often mean that the first pick is given to the Treasury to pick the brightest and the best. So if they're picking the brightest and the best, we now have some very intelligent, competent people in theory who now are sat next to the trough. Now, I then think about the recent Libor criminal case, where it was asserted that it wasn't two individual Libor setters who carried out the offending. It actually came from the top, and by the top I mean the Treasury. And then I think about the case that Andy just alluded to earlier, where a significant number of thousands of people were denied compensation. And I believe, and Andy, I'm sure, will correct me if I get this wrong, but my understanding is that one of the allegations against the FCA was that they allowed, and I use it in rabbit's ears, allowed themselves to be influenced by the Treasury not to pursue this, and by the banks, in other words, to exclude people who should be entitled to compensation, who did not get it. And then I also think about my own situation, where I lost money through the Neil Woodford scandal, where the FCA pushed through a scheme of arrangement that denied us access to the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, because the City of London, A, does not want to scare away people that bring in money, or I would look at it another way, does not want to scare away people who own the trough, and at the same time does not want to be trying to find money to put into the compensation scheme to cover up the wrongdoing of the people it should have been sorting out in the first place. So that's my experience and my learnings, and my question to the three speakers is, what do you three think of the Treasury?
What we'll do, just to manage our time as effectively as possible. Ian set out so many great talking points there, and frankly, in my honest opinion, as I just put in the chat, in my honest opinion, the FCA's handling of the Woodford scandal has been morally bankrupt. Removing people's statutory protections that Parliament put in place as inviolable protections, removing those protections after the event. I mean, what could be more morally bankrupt than that. What we'll do is we'll invite Professor Adnati to chip into the conversation if she'd like to, and then we'll go to our two doctors and our professor for their final comments before we bring tonight's conversation to a close. I'm hoping, gentlemen, just speaking very frankly with you, I'm hoping we might be able to do this again in, say, 6, 9, 12 months or something like that, because it's such a rich conversation. It really, really is. Professor Adnati, if you'd like to, please briefly introduce yourself and chip into the conversation. Thank you, if you'd like to. Oh, you're on mute, Annette. There we go.
I'm muted. Do you hear me now?
Oh, I thought you were. Thank you.
Okay, so I teach at Stanford Business School, and I've become interested in these issues of corporate, crime, misconduct, and consequences. And essentially, corporations as legal persons are just enforcement is poor. That's without mentioning that the laws themselves are often inadequate. And so law enforcement in a corporate context takes forms. First of all, sometimes corporations are not eligible for criminal at all, or like in Germany, or under very difficult, impossible conditions like in the UK. There needs to be a directing mind, all kinds of things like that. And in the US, the common thing is what's called non-prosecution or deferred prosecution agreements with the corporation. And one of the ways they think about it in the US is that they will just get the corporations to, do the work, to come forward, to have compliance program. And in exchange for that, they give them these discounts. Or if they throw somebody under the bus, to be, so they could say that they're following an individual, or they're indicting an individual. And, Boeing recently was the classic poster child of this approach, where, first of all, the fine was exaggerated in the numbers because it was counting all kinds of product liability as if they were fines, and the amount of fine was minimal. In Germany, by the way, corporations cannot be fined more than 10 million euro at very most. So Volkswagen, with a huge cheat on, they can barely retrieve ill-gotten gains, and the cases against the CEO still are pending, and he's getting old. So in the US, they give really a lot of discounts to corporations and then declare victory when they pay fines. But the fines end up being the cost of doing business, because they'll either do the misconduct and pay the fine, or they'll try to they basically they're not deterred enough. And individuals in the corporations are not deterred enough because they have a lot of deniability, at least higher ups. And so essentially what you have a situation that, one way to say it is that a crime requires a criminal mind and a criminal act. So what's called mens rea and exsus reus. And in corporations, oftentimes, like in a mafia organization, the intent is someplace at the top, probably benefit from it, but the act is done by lower level people. And that becomes that nobody is responsible. So it ends up that a corporation can commit crime and no individual person committed a crime. And that basically is the paradox of enforcement. They're afraid of collateral harm if they find the corporation too much and they don't go after the individual. So we're nowhere good on law enforcement. And that's just the law enforcement once there is law. So it's a grim situation when you talk about corporate crime and deterring corporate crime.
Thank you indeed, Professor, over in Stanford. Let's go to Nick now to kind of organise the final comment from himself and his colleagues. Take that in whatever order you'd like to. We just are very, very grateful for the time you spent with us tonight, Nick and James and John.
If I just say something for a second or two, Andy, then I'll hand over to James and maybe John to finish off. Just a couple of observations, I think. As I say, I come from a critical friend perspective for policing, and there are many good police officers and enforcement agencies across the world trying to do their best in quite difficult circumstances. I do take the point. There's one about Greater Manchester Police seem to have put something into the long grass rather than deal with it. And I'm sure there are plenty of examples of where the police haven't provided a public service. One of the conversations we're trying to create, and I think one of the things that we can bring as a university, is networking and bringing people together. We do hold conferences, and we're getting concerned, if you like, about, dare I say, the politics globally and inward-looking nations rather than externally looking nations. So we are trying to set up a conference in the not too distant future involving Interpol, Europol, the FBI, Homeland Security, National Crime Agency, and the like, to have conversations. And it's been my view as I've travelled globally that law enforcement agencies generally want to do a good job, and it's what's restricting them from doing a good job. And I think the professors that talked about it there around the laws that pertain. So, for example, we're all prepared to give our data away to Tesco's, Amazon, and all these big companies. But if law enforcement agencies want to intrude on any of that data, then populations get quite anxious regarding their sort of civil liberties and freedoms. So there is a debate to what extent we're prepared to put up with the abuse of cyber, if you like, if we don't actually give up some of those freedoms in order that the state can protect itself. The other one I would say is, and you talked about I think it was Ian talked about incentivization for managers and sales. There's actually incentivization should be for law enforcement agencies. And people like myself argue that asset confiscation, if that was incentivized with actually given finite resources, there's a reward mechanism built in for successful prosecution and recovery of assets. And if they could be reinvested, that would go a long way. And then I think the last comment I would make, we talked about the politics and the political will, but I think it was at the summit, Andy, there was a suggestion was that actually we need a minister for fraud to corral some of this thinking around. And I just wondered to what extent there is the political appetite, if not the will at the moment, to maybe have a minister of fraud at some point in the future. That's what I wanted to say.
Fantastic, Nick, absolutely fantastic. You know, the irony is this. It was quite funny to remember. We actually do have a minister for fraud. We actually have a minister for fraud, but nobody knows. It's kind of invisible. Somebody said it was like the Scarlet Pimpernel, which is even worse. We've actually got one, but no.
Oh, right, okay, I stand corrected.
honestly. Which of your colleagues should we go to next, Nick?
James,
thank you very much. Thank you. Great.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Thanks, Nick. I wanted to respond to the question that Ian asked in terms of how we move it forward, and one thing that kind of came up, and I started with the creation of the Bank of England in 1694. Notionally, and this again is we're talking about fraud. Notionally, the Bank of England is separate to the Treasury. It's a fraud that in many ways is being perpetrated against people. I put a piece of writing in by Richard Murphy, the economist. Now, I know that not everybody necessarily agrees with him, but the kind of notional separation and the separation of the Bank of England from the Treasury is to exist entirely independently, where there is no power, for example, for essentially the Chancellor to decide to overrule the Bank of England should it be required. We're not being financially well educated is part of the problem, and that is leading to a kind of situation where the wool can be pulled over people's eyes. And going back to what Andy said, at the very start, sunlight and transparency as a kind of as a means of dealing with malpractice. Ultimately, we need to far better understand that there is a degree of control. The state needs to kind of stop running scared from exercising it. They need to get far better recognizing that the requirement to do it, to act in people's interest, not in the interest of a tiny minority of individuals who are very often loath to act out of self-interest, and things can be made better ultimately. and I know that sounds like kind of tremendously kind of utopian and idealistic, and you can kind of go, well, that's naive. Those things can never happen. But I don't think that's the case. We could, if the demand is there and that demands the political action, that will create the will, and the will see it done. The problem at the moment is it's that those debates rarely even feature.
Thank you very much indeed. And last but of course not least, we're now going to go to Dr. John Lamb.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, James and Nick. I think my final point is just to say, have another look at your high streets. Spot those businesses that are those fronts for the international money laundering that we're talking about, because they really are. They are linked to everything we're talking about today, and it is playing out in front of your eyes, and we largely ignore it. And if we ignore it at that level, of course we ignore it at regulatory and political level.
Wonderful, wonderful. It's been a particularly informative session tonight. If we had just had Nick or James or John, it would have been great, but having all three has been a real treat. I have a suggestion, folks. We're already 6 minutes over. I'm going to kind of formally close the meeting now and invite everybody to thank our excellent speakers. But in case anybody's itching to share a point that they've not yet had a chance to, we'll keep the recording running. Just to be clear, we're keeping the recording running. And if anybody wants to come in with a comment or a question, please do. I can feel that there's under the surface desire to share thoughts. So can we please show our appreciation to our two doctors and our professor for a particularly good session tonight. Let's do that in the traditional way. Thank you very much indeed, John and Nick and James. It's been great. Ever so pleased. We've got the Fraud Summit, the next one being organised as soon as we can, March, April time in Parliament. And you guys will be so welcome to come back to that and speak again and give us an update on your thoughts. And maybe in the meantime, somebody could actually hunt down the fraud minister. It's quite funny. I see that Ian Duffield. Ian, as quickly as you can, as succinctly as possible to Ian and anybody else. Quick question, quick comment, and then we'll go to anybody else that wants to chip in with something. We may want to hear, for example, from Mark Bannister or Terry Davis or anybody else. Ian Duffield, the short version, please. The very short version, please. Thank you.
Sure. First of all, very quickly to John's comment. I think it used to be an interesting thing in America that it used to be the dry cleaning shops, I think, didn't it, that were the equivalent over there in Chicago and similar places. And just in reference to James's comment about the Bank of England, a quick observation from me is that when Neil Woodford launched his equity income fund, the fund that I and my wife were a victim of, it was regarded as one of the most significant launches because of Woodford's, I dare say, fame, because he was regarded as one of the best fund managers in the UK. And it was certainly one of the biggest launches, and amazingly enough, one of the biggest financial scandals and collapses of a fund, which, as I say, if you want to see where the criminals are, look where the money is. And one of the last acts of Andrew Bailey, who was at the time the CEO of the FCA, it was pretty much overseeing that collapse, was one of his last acts before he was rewarded as the governor for the Bank of England. So that sort of says it all, doesn't it, really?
Absolutely.
And Gina Miller, who many of you will know from the Brexit stuff, forget the politics of Gina Miller, but Gina and her husband did a great job producing something. I think I've got it in the drawer here. Producing a document called Asleep at the Wheel. Here it is. Asleep at the Wheel. A document setting out a dozen or so reasons in a very evidence and calm way why they felt, as many people agreed, I went to the launch, why they felt Andrew Bailey would be too conflicted to end up running the Bank of England. Another story for another time. Meanwhile, thanks very much, Ian. We'll go to Mr. Mark Bannister. Mark, thank you. The short version, please, Mark. Thank you.
The short version, is there such a thing? First of all, thank you to all three speakers. we've ranged across a hugely broad terrain, and I don't know where to start to respond and to offer some thoughts. But as regards all of this, if we go to the head of the snake, it's our political masters. And the reality of our political masters is that they're all ignorant themselves. There isn't a single one of them, I don't believe, certainly none of our recent prime ministers. Everybody thought that Rishi Sunak, because he'd worked in finance, was knowledgeable. I know exactly where he worked, for whom he worked. For various reasons, I have a very close knowledge of that circumstance. And I'm sure he was very good at doing the structured finance research that he was engaged in. But as for how to run the finances of a country, forget it. Rachel Reeves, we're not even sure, and she's not quite sure whether she was an economist, might be an economist, was vaguely in a department that had economic activity. It doesn't matter. Keir Starmer is a lawyer who wouldn't know one end of a balance sheet from another. So the reality is all of these people are completely dependent upon the civil servants who direct their every action. And as a result, it's a comedy and everything flows down from there. So the reality is we're never going to change this until there are knowledgeable people who know what they're doing right at the epicenter. Separate to that, and I do not mean the judiciary, because actually what I would like to see is, and I've mentioned this before, is effectively a star chamber group where you have perhaps 5,000 people drawn from all walks of life, where the one qualifying thing is they must not have been at the top of their game in any particular sphere. And by I'm interested in all the number 3s, 4s, and 5s, people who are incredibly competent but never reach the zenith, because simply the zenith is a pinnacle of one, but who could have been at the zenith but never got the power, and they should be marking independently everybody's homework. If they don't like, and it would never be one or two of them, it would be a committee of 5 of them, and they would never know who the other members of the 5 were, so that they all have formed independent opinions, and then all of the actions and all the undertakings would be reviewed and looked at and marked in real time. And when we get that, we'll get proper government. We will get diversity of opinion. We will get diversity of approach. We will have no center that can manipulate all the different things. Now, James mentioned about the Bank of England being subject to the Treasury. I want to tell you a little story. It goes, James may know it, but
I'm going to ask you for the short version.
I'll give you the very concise. When World War I broke out, okay, all our banks had lent all the capital of the City of London and the financial system to the Germans, and we were at war with them. They were never going to pay us back. It was done, right? What did the Bank of England do? It said, boys, do not tell or breathe a word of this to anyone, right? But send us all your IOUs and we will cash them for you. Basically, they refinanced the entire UK. Now, back in the beginning of the World War, First World War in 2014, bear in mind, we were still ruled basically 1/5 of the total population of the globe, right? All of this can be done. Money is not what you think it is. It doesn't. I mean, James, when last time he was on, I told him money doesn't exist, and he was nodding furiously, and I see he is again now. Money is a mechanism that cancels debt.
Yes, absolutely.
Until we understand about credit. I mean, I like to think about Adam and Eve. Did Adam, when he picked up the apple and gave it to Eve and started all this trouble, right? Did he pay for it? No, he did not, because he didn't have a coin in his pocket, right? He used, if he paid for that apple, he used credit. He left a little, if he was an honest bloke, he left a little IOU for the farmer whose apple it was. And he said, I owe you some money. right? And the point is, we need to understand about how all of this works, because until we understand how it works and how it doesn't work, we don't understand how we're being manipulated. And I take Dr. Lamb's point about our high streets. Well, they're a very basic form of manipulation, and I don't deny what he's saying at all. I mean, I completely agree and concur with it. But when you think that then when it gets into our banking system, and why do we tolerate those shops? Well, the answer is we need the money. Why do we tolerate all the Russian oligarchs? Because we need the foreign exchange. We need that flow of money into sterling, and we're very happy to accept it.
And therein, Mark,
but the point is, what I would say, Andy, when we do this again, let's confine ourselves to some really top topics or headlines and just really drill into them, because as much as I enjoyed this conversation, and very worthwhile it is, but we ranged across such a broad sphere that we've ended up focusing on nothing. I have one very quick final thing to say, and that's to Nick Howe, because I don't want him to feel that he's left out. And it comes to, my God, we need an independent police force that really understands this, okay? And fraud can have nothing whatsoever to do with the City of London. Oh my God. That is like having the criminals operate the jails.
We'll wrap it up there, folks. I've just put a little kind of straw poll thing in the chat. So I wrote something like, who'd like the two docs and the prof to come back again? Please do put a yes, please in the chat if you'd like to have a rerun of this or an evolution of this at some future point in time, be that 6, 9, 12 months or so from now. Please do take the time to express support for that idea, because these guys are busy. It's their evening time. If they had any sense, they'd be putting their feet up watching TV right now, but they're not. They're actually with us, sharing insights and wisdoms and experience that's remarkably interesting for all of us. Very, very final point. My big takeaway is that we have a police force that has potential to do better. The reason it's not doing better is not because of issues with the police force itself. I think, this tonight's session has helped me to see this, I think the police force is operating in an ecosystem that is actually stopping it from doing what it would probably want to do. There are resource issues, there are political issues, there are competing priority issues, and all the rest of it. And I think we should do what we can, whenever we can, to kind of be a friendly critic to the police and the work that they do, and help them wherever we can to get their message across that they want to do things better and differently, and things are actually structural things that hold them back. I hope that's a fair comment, folks. Thank you all for being here, especially Professor Adnati, who flew all the way over from Stanford. Joke there. And I still haven't thought of the two professors and a doctor, Jake, but I'll work on it. Meanwhile, I just want to invite everybody to thank James and John and Nick once again for a great session. Forgive me for being so bad with my time management. You know what I'm writing. But that was great, guys. We'll follow up with some ideas, and I'll definitely introduce you to Professor Adnati in Stanford. I think there's a good connection there. Good night, all. Thank you very, very much indeed. Thanks, John. Thank you all. Absolutely brilliant. Blown away by that. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good night.